To move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. And we will begin with the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Premier. I know, that's what I said. It would get moldy, I know. In February 2016, media reported that a 16-year-old girl in care had died. Her mother said she found out about this tragedy through news media. The Minister of Community Services said it was the police's responsibility to contact the next of kin. The police agreed, and they took that responsibility, and they contacted the child's legal guardian, the province. All of us can imagine how painful it would be to hear this kind of tragic news on the news from a reporter. Can the Premier confirm that a compassionate protocol has been established to spare families this sort of pain in the event of the death of another child?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know the specifics of this particular case, but I can assure this member and all members of the House, and indeed all Nova Scotians, that when a child comes into care into our province, and our first priority is to reunify that child with their own family, or quite frankly, find another family unit that will be able to nurture that child for the rest of their life as they grow into adulthood. At times, those children, that is impossible for all kinds of reasons, some of which are speakable and some of which, quite frankly, aren't. None of us would understand the connection that happens in the breakdown in some family units. The fact of the matter is, when children come into our care, we do become the guardian. We do everything we can to act as their parent and try to provide them a loving environment. And let me say this to the people who work in our Department of Community Services, who on a daily basis deal with not only children but families in challenging circumstances. I want to thank them on behalf of all of us for the work that they do, not only in our constituencies but in the central office, to ensure that we do everything we can to provide them with that caring and loving environment.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Premier for that response. And this is difficult for me to say, but the department failed this family. Let me continue. Earlier this week, the aunt of the young woman who died said 2 years later the family is still fighting to learn how the girl died, and I will table that report. They are looking for simply a meeting, a phone call, or some kind of acknowledgement from the department that took her into their care. The death triggered a critical incident review within the department. But after 2 years, the report is still not complete. 2 years later, does the Premier believe a family should wait 2 years to find out how their loved one died while in the care of the province?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll ask the Minister of Community Services to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question, and I want to assure her, while I cannot speak to individual cases, that any time there is the death of a child who is in care of the province, a report would in fact be published. If the death was the result of any abuse or neglect while the child was in the care of the province, there's also a procedure there if there is a sudden injury or an unexpected death as well. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on her final supplementary.
I think we can all sit here and imagine what it would be like if it was one of our loved ones. 2 years without any type of dialogue or contact. At the Standing Committee on Community Services in January, staff from the Department of Community Services said the department has been considering establishing an Office of Child and Youth Advocate. Kind of on and off. They said they've been considering it the last few years. Child advocates in some parts of the province want the government to establish a child advocate to speak out and advocate on behalf of our young people. Now, the College of Social Workers also wants Nova Scotia to have a child and youth advocate. So my question to the Premier is, will he confirm that there is going to be money in this upcoming budget to establish an independent child and youth advocate office?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I will let our budget speak for itself. I'm looking forward to the Minister of Finance standing in this House to table her budget, but I want to assure the honourable member and all members of this House that when a child comes into care to the province, that we know that they were in permanent care. We do everything we can to provide them a nurturing and loving environment, Mr. Speaker, to support them the best we can. In many ways, they're very tragic circumstances that some of these children are brought into our care for. Some of the ones, Mr. Speaker, that no member in this House would think were even possible, that some children are born into these circumstances. All of us, most of us, have come from a nurturing, loving environment. We become that as parents, provide them with the support we can. We face the reality, in some cases, there are children who have not experienced that. And we need to do our best to ensure that the system is there to respond to those children as they continue to go forward, and that is one of the things that we continue to do. As a government, not as this government, every government in the province, in the history of this province, has attempted to respond to the many challenges that are faced with us. And let me again say to you, there are frontline men and women in this province, day in and day out, who take heartache stories home with them to try to respond to the needs of these children, and we're doing all we can, as every government has, to ensure that we support them.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier is about long-term care. According to data obtained by our caucus, over the course of the last 5 years, 1,877 patients admitted to hospital awaiting transfer to long-term care passed away while waiting for a nursing home bed in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, can the Premier explain why so many people have had to wait so long in hospital for placement in a nursing home that they've passed away before they've got there?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman for the question. I'm not going to question his statistics, Mr. Speaker. We know that many people in this province have told us they continue to want to remain in their home as long as possible. That's why we've continued to invest in home care to support, provide we have those supports in and around individuals to be able to stay in the home as long as possible. We know at some point people will transition into long-term care. We want to thank those who are partnering with us to make sure we continue to provide that opportunity. As over the last number of years, we're seeing that list, the wait list, continue to drop. We'll continue to work to ensure that that everyone is placed in a nursing home bed as quickly as possible. But at the same time, we're going to respond to what most Nova Scotians tell us, and that is the fact they want to stay at home as long as possible, and we're going to continue to invest in home care.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2013, when the Liberal government took office, they did not proceed with the NDP plan at the time to build 350 additional nursing home beds. And 5 years later, we have 1,128 people on the waiting list for a nursing home placement. Mr. Speaker, what does the Premier say to those 1,128 people waiting for a nursing home bed in our province?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the gentleman for the question. What I'm going to say to those people, Mr. Speaker, when we came in 2013, the wait list under that government was over 2,000 people. Mr. Speaker, we know 1,000 is too many. We're going to continue to work with those families to ensure that they have access to long-term care. But one of the things that we've heard in every corner of this province is that people want to stay home as long as possible, and we're going to continue to work with home care providers to ensure that we continue to provide that support inside of the system. We're working with families on the caregiver allowance to make sure that the loved ones are providing that support at home for as long as possible. Same time, we know, Mr. Speaker, that at some point people will transition into long-term care, and we want to make sure that they have that opportunity.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the past 5 years, 718,230 bed days in our hospitals were used for people who were not hospital patients at all, but were rather waiting for placement in a nursing home. The obvious result is a shortage of available acute care spaces. So I ask the Premier, will he commit to opening the new long-term care beds the previous NDP government had planned to open before he came to power?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. It is unfortunate, Mr. Speaker, in many ways, the question coming from the Democratic Party, who ended up putting this province in such a desperate financial state at the time, Mr. Speaker. We're continuing to do our best to continue to make sure that we continue to respond to the long-term care needs of Nova Scotians, continue to respond to ensure that the issues that are facing Nova Scotians when it comes to home care, we've heard from them.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We continue to respond to the needs of Nova Scotia. Tell us they want to stay home as long as possible. We'll continue to make that investment in home care. We'll continue to ensure that we support families and the caregivers allowance, finding ways to actually respond to what Nova Scotians want, Mr. Speaker, which is able to stay home as long as possible, surrounded by their loved ones.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Education. Yesterday, we learned that after March break, Halifax Regional School Board will be eliminating a series of courtesy bus stops that were addressing some unintended gaps under the province's 3.6-kilometre guidelines. One family actually had made arrangements for their child to attend after-school care, but had relied on these courtesy stops to deliver their child safely to that after-school care. Without the stop, this 5-year-old will now have to walk 2 kilometres on a route with no sidewalks. Is the Minister of the opinion that a 5-year-old walking 2 kilometres without sidewalks is safe and appropriate?
The Honourable Premier. Pardon me, the Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In fact, these are one of the inconsistencies that we want to address by unifying the system, because we do have different transportation policies from one region to the next in the province. As the member stated, this was a decision made by the school board. Of course, when the governance structure of the system changes, transportation policies will be a focus of ours in terms of ensuring that we're doing our very best to get our kids to and from school safely.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister cannot continue to keep hiding behind the school boards in this province. But we know that will change. Mr. Speaker, this House has been debating a substantial piece of legislation designed to change the way our schools are administered. It is the belief of the government that local elected school boards are not necessary and that the best thing for the education system is to centralize the decision-making. It is what the government wants, and it seems, though, they may just get what they want this time around. My question for the Minister of Education is, once Bill 72 receives royal assent, will he commit to using his new centralized powers to immediately reinstate the courtesy bus stops cancelled by the HRM School Board?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Of course, student safety, getting to and from school safely is an absolute priority for us. The member has made the case that there is variances in how our transportation policy is being implemented from one region to the next. These are one of the challenges that we're looking to address with these changes, with modernizing our education system and unifying it. I do want to clarify something for the member, though. There is also elements of decentralization happening to ensure there's more site management happening with principals, with VPs, more decision-making authority that's actually given back to communities, Mr. Speaker. That, along with having consistent best practices applied from one end of this province to the next, will better improve the situation for our kids. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. This government is poised to eliminate democratically elected school boards with the stroke of a pen. Also concerning is the fact that the Provincial Advisory Committee meant to advise the Minister on matters related to education will be meeting in secret. School board meetings are open to the public, but that will not be the case for this advisory body of political appointees. We've seen how well this has served the public interest in health, and I question why we'd be making the same mistake in education. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister explain how closed-door meetings by appointed representatives is in the best interest of our children?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As is consistent with any advice that's given to Cabinet, this has been consistent with every single party that has served on government benches. Advice to Cabinet is considered confidential. That is consistent in the Westminster system. And the reason for that is so people giving advice can do so forthrightly, speak frankly and openly in providing that advice and to protect them, Mr. Speaker. So this is consistent with Westminster parliamentary system across the Commonwealth and has been consistent practice with every single government that has served on these benches. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, I am heartened by the opposition, the people across the aisle's commitment to democracy in the Westminster system. Mr. Speaker, over and over again, our caucus has raised concerns about the diverse local voices being silenced by this government's education reforms. It is our understanding that the transition team established by the minister will include the school board chairs and the chair of the Council on African Canadian Education. However, African Nova Scotian School Board Caucus, the 7 members elected by the African Nova Scotians of this province, were not included on the list of those who were asked to put forward designates for this transition team. Mr. Speaker, Halifax Regional School Board African Nova Scotian Board member Archie Beals has said that the caucus independently put forward a list of names to the minister anyway, but they have heard no response. Mr. Speaker, can the minister explain why the elected African Nova Scotian School Board caucus was excluded from the transition team, and will he contact Mr. Beals to address his concern?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So the transition team has not been put together yet. In speaking with the board chairs, they are interested in assisting with the transition, but that, of course, won't happen until after the law is passed and we are entering into a period of transition. I know that the African Nova Scotian School Board Caucus has submitted 3 names for that transition team. All 3 of those members will be on the transition team once that transition team is established. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of TIR. Stormy weather over the last few weeks has shown Nova Scotia the strength of Mother Nature. High seas closed Route 207 at Lawrencetown Beach, but a little farther east in East Chesapeake, local residents are concerned because the sea breached a berm for the 2nd time this year. Residents say that this week's breach was significant and allowed salt water to fill a freshwater lake. They believe that the Minister's Department should have acted last month when the first breach occurred. Mr. Speaker, my question is, I understand staff from the department surveyed the berm very recently. Why did it take so long for the department to act when the first breach occurred in January?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me say that the department is constantly dealing with the issues of coastal erosion along our coast. As I mentioned previously, because of the nature of the way the roads have evolved in Nova Scotia, many of our roads are right at sea level because that was the easiest way to build them, 100 years ago when they were being established. The primary department actually that's dealing with that is my colleague at DNR, and we have been attending the meetings both at Chesapeake and 207 to add what we can when it becomes our turn to act, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I do appreciate the fact that the roads have been built 100 years ago. It's just nice if they'd get some action in the meantime, because it's been 100 years since you did anything to them.
Order, please. I'd like to remind the Honourable Member not to address fellow members directly. The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
I'm listening carefully, by the way.
Residents of East Chesapeake worry every time there is a stormy weather in the forecast. They are concerned that each storm puts the lake, the beach, and indeed their properties in jeopardy. Worried residents believe that the department dragged its feet on finding a solution to this problem. So the question for the minister is simple. Will the minister commit today to giving residents of East Chesapeake some peace of mind and tell them when the berm will be repaired?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I must congratulate the member for that area who has sprung to action and coordinated an extensive meeting of all the parties concerned associated with that, including our department. The matter is well in hand.
Order, please. Let the Honourable Member speak. The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
With a breach which is quite a distance away from the road. We are actually reviewing a significant culvert that's there that may require some resizing. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, that I'm a little dismayed recently that the member opposite has spurned my invitation to come down and visit with him by putting conditions on the travel that we would be involved with in his area. And I'm reconsidering that invitation that I sent to go down there because I need a guide, and he seems to be saying he's not going to help me. Thank you.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is also to the Minister of TIR. When travelling the Western Head Mersey Point Loop, there is a section of road in Scotts Bay that has been compromised for quite some time. And since the storm surge this past weekend, it has become even worse. At this spot, the shoulder has sustained serious erosion, and it appears to be so unsafe that residents are asking for an engineer to comment on the current road condition. School buses travelling along this road travel along this road, but it has become so dangerous that one resident drives her child to school in fear that the bus will slip off the road. My question is, will the minister commit to the constituents of Queen Shelburne to have this dangerous section of road repaired before this erosion causes a tragedy?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I mentioned earlier, we are certainly cognizant of the threat that the recent storm surges have caused in the province, and our team is out there working diligently to assess these situations and to prioritise them and to take corrective action. Thank you.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the minister was told last year during estimates, the causeway at Western Head has required attention for quite some time now. During a large storm several years ago, the roadway washed out, and TIR's solution was to build a large cement block seawall. Approximately 2 years ago, during a significant storm, the new seawall was breached, and last December, the roadway and asphalt sustained further damage, resulting in the causeway being closed. Unfortunately, due to the high winds and storm surge of this past weekend, the roadway has sustained even further damage, making the situation more dangerous. My question is, can the minister guarantee that this issue that has been ongoing far too long will be addressed and rectified no later than June, so residents and tourists can use this area without fear of encountering this dangerous section of highway?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, one of the advantages that we have in Nova Scotia is that we are a virtual island, and we are on all sides subject to the ebb and flow of the tides, as it were, and the storms. And in managing that, as I mentioned before, with all our coastal highways, we're constantly reviewing our priorities and where we will act. I'll undertake to the member that we will take a look at the Western Head Causeway and see if it is moved up the priority list. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, it was revealed that this government is falling down on the job when it comes to monitoring home care service providers. In his report in November 2017, the Auditor General sharply criticized the Department of Health and the Nova Scotia Health Authority for failing to verify service hours billed by home care providers. The Auditor General found that neither verified accuracy of hours were verified by Department of Health or Nova Scotia Health Authority. He identified because there is no basic oversight, this represents a high risk of fraud. This was originally raised with the department in 2016, but as of November 2017, the problem still had not been fixed, and I would like to table that document. Question to the Minister of Health. Can he provide a progress update on the necessary controls to assess hours billed by healthcare providers?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. As the member knows, this government, since we formed government in 2013, have recognized that Nova Scotians' priority for care has been care at home when possible. So we've made significant investments there. We've virtually eliminated wait lists in many parts of the province, Mr. Speaker. And with respect to the recommendations of the Auditor General, Mr. Speaker, we continue to work to make progress towards those recommendations in all aspects.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this is about accountability and setting up processes so that we know what's being billed is what's being paid. So because there's no process in place, we don't know if it's accurate. For example, I had someone tell me last week that it's very common for providers to call and say they're not showing up that day. So my question would be, is that provider still being paid? And right now there's no process for us to know that. The other thing to identify is the process is different if the business is for-profit or if it's a not-for-profit. And even the processes are different. One puts in their bills to the Department of Health and one puts into the Nova Scotia Health Authority. So my question to the minister is, can he confirm steps that steps have been taken since the Auditor General's report to ensure taxpayers' money is being wisely spent?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can thank the member for the question, an opportunity to highlight that, in fact, many steps have been taken, Mr. Speaker, to move forward and improve the delivery of data collection and support in our home care from our home care service providers. This will help us, Mr. Speaker, in responding to the Auditor General's recommendations. But the member opposite did make reference to a lot of the variances that take place in this area, in this field, and that's because this service has evolved over many, many years, Mr. Speaker, and we're trying to pull it together so we do get standard services and practices right across this province.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister responsible for the status of women. This government has been told again and again that the elimination of elected school boards is a setback for women's participation in politics. Only 17 of the 50 members of this House are women. That's 34%. In the government's cabinet, only 5 of 17 ministers are women. That's 29%. Nova Scotia has 11 federal members of Parliament and only 1 of them is a woman. That's 9%. These are troubling numbers, Mr. Speaker, and in contrast, 55% of Nova Scotian women make up school boards. So my question for the minister is this: isn't she concerned that eliminating elected school boards further disenfranchises women in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister responsible for the status of women.
I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question, and I do want to point out that in fact this Premier has appointed the most women ever to the Executive Council of any Premier of all time, Mr. Speaker. I would also note, Mr. Speaker, that we do have a campaign college coming up very soon. I spoke about this earlier today. There's a campaign college for women who are interested in running for office. I would urge all members of this House, if they know of a woman who might be who might want to run for office or who might want to manage a campaign, to come out to this campaign college. It is, bar none, the best campaign college I've ever been to. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, unfortunately, that college won't help school board members. But, Mr. Speaker, when the Premier is asked why he supports removing the 57 elected women from their roles, he says he's proud of his record of supporting women. Yet, over and over again, women have been the most negatively impacted by this government's actions. Government bills have attacked home support workers, community and health workers, nurses, and the lowest paid frontline workers. Over 90% of the thousands of Nova Scotians attacked by these laws are women. And now the government's attacking teachers and school board officials, also a majority of women. So perhaps the Premier is a little confused about his record because he's not aware that women are actually much more than just mothers and daughters. So my question for the Minister of the Status of Women is this: is the Minister responsible for the status of women? Does she really agree with the Premier that the elimination of 57 elected women is just nothing to be concerned about?
The Honourable Minister responsible for the status of women.
I would point out to my honourable colleague that while she does sniff at the 34% that women now occupy of the seats here in this House, it is in fact the highest number of women ever elected here in Nova Scotia. And I would say that the Advisory Council on the Status of Women Campaign College helped women get into this chamber. We know there are because they're sitting here today. I would also point out that this Premier appointed the first female Prime Minister, Deputy Premier, the second woman Deputy Premier, the first female or woman Attorney General, the second female Attorney General, and we finally have gender parity on the bench because of the work done by this government. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last night I was troubled to learn that parents of Ian Forsyth students were informed through a Facebook group that the school had failed air quality checks in February. Several staff and students have gotten ill from unsafe levels of benzene in the air, a known carcinogen. HRSB staff is currently stating the air is safe, yet students and staff are sick. This morning I visited the school. It is the responsibility of the school and school board to update parents on situations like these so they can make informed decisions on the safety of their children. My office has contacted the Department of Education, the superintendent of the HRSB, chair of HRSB, African Nova Scotian representative on HRSB, and the NSTU. Action needs to be taken immediately to determine the cause of this, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister of Education provide the House and parents of Dartmouth East an update on the status of Ian Forsyth Elementary School?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I did receive these reports as well. According to the regional office, the air quality is safe. However, I do know that they are conducting further sample testing today, Mr. Speaker, and of course, myself, the regional office and the public need to have the best information possible so that we know what the risks are and so that we can act, Mr. Speaker. But at this particular point in time, the best information is telling us that the air quality is safe.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Speaker, I appreciate the Minister of Education's response. However, my office is still receiving calls from parents that their children are sick. So, Mr. Speaker, we know many children and staff are sick right now, and we don't know how many more may come down with symptoms until we get to the bottom of this situation. Given there is a family doctor crisis in our province, and our walk-in clinics in Dartmouth East are often at capacity, will the Minister of Education today commit to working with public health officials to investigate and offer health care supports directly to the families impacted by this? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned in my previous response, there are further sample testings happening today. Obviously, the evidence, the science, the facts of the air quality is of paramount interest for us to make sure that that air quality is safe, Mr. Speaker. Student safety is the absolute priority for each and every single person in the education system. And in this particular case, I believe the proper steps are being taken to ensure that kids at Ian Forsyth are well protected. Thank you.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, in the midst of all the confusion this government has ignited over education, has it forgotten to include Nova Scotian Gaels? Now, in the 2015 Action Plan for Education, there was an emphasis placed on improving curriculum to reflect the distinct culture and history of this province's Acadians, Mi'kmaq, African Nova Scotians, and Gaels. But in the Raise the Bar report, there was not a single instance of the words Gaelic or Gaels. And in the education reforms that we see this government putting forward, there's nothing either. Mr. Speaker, have centuries of ethnic cleansing work? Does the minister believe that Gaels have been assimilated? And is this why Gaels appear to be so irrelevant in these discussions?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. I know that this issue is an ongoing concern for and priority for him and his community. I did receive a notification from the Gaels that they did not feel that they were properly consulted, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the recommendations that came forward on Dr. Glaze's report. So I think we need to make sure that we have an open line of communication with that community and see what they need. I know that they do benefit from the Gaelic College in Inverness County, and if there are additions that we need to look at in terms of making sure that we have a curriculum that is fully sensitive to the various cultures in this province, I'm very happy to hear recommendations. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I feel like I've just swung my claymore in the general direction of the minister. And it's not my intention to injure him. I appreciate his comments, Mr. Speaker, but I hope I've made my point. So the reality, Mr. Speaker, is that there are thousands of young Nova Scotians who want to learn Gaelic and who want to learn their history. And they're from Mabou right to Citadel High here in Halifax. So, Mr. Speaker, Those people need the support of the Department of Education, and they need the support of this government. Can the minister advise on how the Department of Education will work with the Gaelic community to ensure that our culture and language continue to play an important part in the inclusive nature of education in our province?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Of course, I think the best way we can accomplish that is through our curriculum, enhancing our curriculum. We've done a lot of work in relation to the various cultures and traditions that we have in the province, but of course we need to continue to make sure that we enhance our curriculum to best reflect the great diversity and experiences that people in this province have had. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, earlier today I introduced my constituent Sharon Kehoe. She and her husband and 9 members of her extended family are among the thousands in the Valley without a family doctor, and they are all on their doctor registry. About a year ago, she was fortunate to have her family doctor's practice taken over by a young doctor new to our area, only to have that doctor return to Newfoundland after 6 months because he could earn more money. Meanwhile, Sharon's husband has high blood pressure, which they endeavour to get treated using clinics. However, clinics are not permitted to order tests, which makes treatment complicated. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister of Health is, when can Sharon and her husband and her family and thousands of others like her in the Annapolis Valley expect to be able to get a family doctor?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for raising the question. As the member knows, the province has been our partners at the Nova Scotia Health Authority and the IWK have been working hard, diligently on recruiting healthcare professionals across the province, Mr. Speaker. Those efforts include consideration of the remuneration and incentive packages. We've made changes, Mr. Speaker, based upon the feedback that we've received from people on the front lines as to what may support and help facilitate their decisions to move and stay here in Nova Scotia. Examples include progress around our tuition rebates, Mr. Speaker, work that we're doing with a partnership with my colleague and the Minister of Immigration around a stream for physician immigrants. Mr. Speaker, we're doing a lot of work to try to recruit and bring primary care to all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Minister for the answer. Mr. Speaker, Sharon also recently provided palliative care for her uncle living in Cape Breton who wanted to die at home. She stated that the support system is awful. There's no nursing support other than a visit from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. There's no doctor care normally other than once every 2 weeks. They were fortunate to have access to Dr. Bob Martel, but they had to administer and make decisions about when to give morphine. Worst of all, she stated, was that for her uncle was having his nieces hold him up, pull down his pants and clean him. A person should be able to die with a little more dignity than that. My question for the minister is this: when will this government provide adequate palliative care with supports for those who wish to die at home rather than relying on family to do the heavy lifting?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for raising the question. And indeed, work around hospice access, Mr. Speaker, and palliative care supports is ongoing in the province. Under my predecessor, the former Minister of Health, current Minister of Community, Culture and Heritage, they developed a framework for hospice facilities for communities that wish to pursue that as an option. Mr. Speaker, for those who wish to receive palliative supports in their home, there are a number of options. Sometimes they are with nurses or physicians, but indeed we also have paramedics, Mr. Speaker, throughout the province who provide palliative care services as well. So there are a wide variety of supports available to people looking for those services. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Energy. Last week, the Minister repeated that the fracking moratorium continues, but at the same time, fracking is still an option. This government's attempt to have it both ways is sowing division in communities desperate for a clearer path toward economic development. Community members in Guysborough have had to organize themselves to make it abundantly clear once again that fracking is a dead end. In the words of one young woman from Guysborough, we do not need a boom and bust economy, we need jobs to sustain us for generations to come. And I'll table that. Will the Minister stand with Nova Scotians across the province and clearly state that fracking is not a road this province is going to go down?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I didn't, in any attempt to be unclear last week, the status quo is in effect. The moratorium remains in place. We made the commitment when we brought the moratorium in 2014 that we would do an onshore atlas to understand where these pockets may be, in what regions, and to what effect. We did that. What we said was that if industry, if communities feel that there's a different conversation because of technology changes, if there's somehow a change in social license and people support fracking, that they would come forward with some idea of how they would want to get there to do some kind of testing, Mr. Speaker. We haven't opened it up. One letter from a municipality doesn't constitute opening up the moratorium. I haven't received any information from the group that the member has suggested, so if there's something that she could bring forward, we'd certainly be willing to take a look at that. But as we said, status quo, the moratorium on fracking is in place in Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, the moratorium may be in place on paper, but the government has still not proclaimed it, and that is one of the reasons why members of communities across Nova Scotia are wondering if this government really wants a moratorium. Jim Guy, Professor Emeritus at Cape Breton University, suggests that the government is deliberately foot-dragging on making a legal definition of fracking so they can have a backdoor option to bypass the moratorium, and I'll table that. Will the government tell this House when the government will finish the regulations for the fracking moratorium and proclaim the ban on fracking?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, the regulations around fracking are the reason why they've taken as long as they have is because we had to do a jurisdictional scan and understand that if there was some kind of regulatory piece around the testing and some kind of research related to fracking, that we would allow that to happen. So, for all intents and purposes, the proclamation of that legislation will take place. There is a ban on fracking. There's no doubt about it. I don't understand why, for some people, there has to be a question of this information. There has to be a challenge for the fracking moratorium that's in place. It's banned. There's no information that comes forward, then we'll obviously consider that. But at this point, we haven't changed our position on this, Mr. Speaker. There's information around fracking. There's information around the onshore atlas, and we shouldn't be afraid of information. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, there is a pressing need in Cape Breton Richmond that leaves the residents struggling to earn a living. I speak of the lack of reliable cell phone service, and when I say lacking, I really mean that there's no cell phone service in a lot of the communities, specifically in Forshoe, Framboise, Grand River, and Dundee. I've received numerous letters from business owners in these areas about this issue. One business owner operates a local seafood company that operates a fleet of vehicles and fishing vessels. I would ask everyone in this chamber to consider how much our jobs have changed since smartphones have become a part of our everyday lives. Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister would be, does he believe that functioning, reliable cell phone service is critical to the operation of a modern business?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. I absolutely do believe that is the case. Broadband and the internet connectivity for Nova Scotians has been a priority for us. We've carried a heavy load in relation to other provinces with respect to our investment in broadband, and we're working on a significant plan for broadband that we will share in the coming weeks as part of the Minister of Finance's budget, and we're looking forward to the long-term positive impact that'll have on many people in Nova Scotia. Thanks.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his response regarding broadband service, but my question is regarding cell phone service. Sitting here in the centre of our provincial capital, I think we've become somewhat, well, we take cellular coverage for granted here in an urban environment. It's how we communicate with our families, our friends, our colleagues, and our employers and our employees. Cellular service keeps track of our schedules, provides us with GPS, and is a key conduit to vast information that has become essential to everyday life. Mr. Speaker, does the minister agree that those business owners who have contacted me, they need unified cellular service in this province? We need cellular service in these communities. Will the minister please provide cellular service in these communities?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again, I thank the member. Obviously, the cell phone service and having that coverage is part of the broadband conversation and all the Connecting Canadians budgetary allotments that are coming from the federal government, and of course in conjunction with the heavy investment that we'll make as a province. My colleague, the Minister of Municipal Affairs, is very much engaged on from the perspective of EMO and having emergency service and access to cell phone coverage for many of the areas in this province. There's no doubt about it. I'll tell the honourable member and her constituents, we've got to do better at coverage for cell phones, not only for of course the growth of our economy and allowing rural areas to drum up business and build businesses, but it's of course important for safety and security, Mr. Speaker. So we will continue to make those investments, and we do appreciate the question. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Transportation. Highway 289 is a very important transportation link in my constituency. However, with all the traffic on this route, the asphalt is showing its age and it's crumbling under the current traffic. Without proper maintenance, the shoulders of the road are no longer supporting the edges of the highway, and it's making for unsafe travel. Can the Minister assist the drivers of Highway 289 by allocating necessary funds needed this year to make this transportation route safe again?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. I would draw the member's attention to the RIM budget, and I hope he's had an opportunity to input on that. This government has increased the RIM funding, which had been cut by the previous government significantly some time ago, and this is the money that goes towards shouldering. Shouldering is very important for us because it has a safety consideration, and I'll check and see if the shouldering is in for 289 is in the RIM budget, and the member can do that also. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
I appreciate that answer because the shoulders are really creating the problem because of the size of the trucks, and it's in a rural area, and besides the tractor wheels are so wide that the road cannot handle that kind of traffic. So the Minister already answered my next question, that he will look at the shoulders in the Highway 289 and make an assessment. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. All too often we talk about mental health in this chamber. I know that recently we lost a psychiatrist at the Aberdeen Hospital and left with one psychiatrist at that time. And we also know that we lost our short stay unit 3 years ago that, by the way, was supposed to be temporary. But we are always told that a new model has been put in place and that it's working well. Change is absolutely about belief. I'd like to know if the Minister believes the new model is working for 46,000 people in Pictou County.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and certainly appreciate the concerns that the member opposite, the Leader of the Official Opposition, brings forward. I don't think anybody in this legislature questions her commitment to the area of mental health and advocating on behalf of her constituents and Nova Scotians in that regard. But what I can say, Mr. Speaker, is that we are working. We recognize as a government the opportunity and the needs to do more around mental health. That's why we continue to invest with a disproportionate amount of investment, new investment going towards our youth, Mr. Speaker, partnering with our school system to expand our Schools Plus, to get the health centres in place and provide those clinicians close to students, because we know that young Nova Scotians, young people, is when mental health conditions first expose themselves, and getting treatment and diagnosis early is better for the long-term care of these individuals.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister for his thoughtful response. I did hear the word invest. So we lost our unit. We were down to one psychiatrist in a population, again, of 46,000 people. We know the crisis has been brought to a new level with regards to mental health. We have lost, as of today, our one and only psychiatrist for the next, well, we don't know, they're off. So I'd like the minister to stand up, please, and promise the Pictou County residents that he will invest in at least a locum to come in and serve that time that we have no psychiatrists.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, again, I do appreciate the concern being raised by the member opposite the interim leader for the official opposition. Mr. Speaker, while I do appreciate the concerns and the challenge presented for her constituents and those in the area served by, when you have a psychiatrist, a specialist who leaves, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately the situation there is not limited to the people of Pictou County. The Nova Scotia Health Authority and the IWK are working diligently to attempt to recruit psychiatrists for vacant positions throughout the province, Mr. Speaker. They're going to fill those positions as soon as they can, and they're making every effort to do so, but there is a shortage right across this country.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Mr. Speaker, my question today is for the Minister of Environment, who began to answer it yesterday but ran out of time, so I'm sure he'd enjoy continuing it. Mr. Speaker, Halifax is sending bags to landfills and other towns. Bags are piling up, plastic bags, and Nova Scotians are calling for a ban on plastics. In fact, they're saying that the province needs to act. So, Mr. Speaker, China gave us 6 months warning that they'd no longer recycle our bags, and it's become clear the government must have missed the memo. So if the government had planned ahead, we could have had a solution by now. Mr. Speaker, will the minister please explain?
Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired.